The opinions expressed are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the official positions of the sponsors, advertisers, or presenters. Advertising does not imply endorsement by the sponsors and presenters.
Welcome, everyone, to the Lighting Controls Podcast. We're your co-hosts, Webster Marsh and Ron Kuzma. Today, we've got an interesting conversation about POE with MHT with AK and Kim. But first, we'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, Toggled. Ron, you want to tell us a little bit more?
Absolutely. So Toggled, as I'm sure you guys know by now because you've been listening, is part of a global tech company that provides software and cloud solutions for IoT, high-performance computing, and data analytics. They have a grassroots approach to NLC, networked lighting controls. They added radio to their linear lamps and expanded from there. They have a distributed approach to lighting controls, and you are just a lamp swap away from having a network lighting control system because they've introduced that Bluetooth into all of their lamps. So it's wireless, it's ideal for adding into existing buildings, and you don't have to do a complete teardown or retrofit of existing tube fixtures. Cybersecurity, they have you covered. They have all the appropriate certifications, optional gateways to connect to cloud, you name it, they can take care of you. No fees for API integration, and a truly customer-centric approach to network lighting controls. So be sure to check out Toggled for more information.
So go to Toggled, TOGGLED.com to check out more great stuff that they got there. Also, this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA, and it's financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And if you're curious and you haven't heard any other episodes other than this one, or you just want to check out some old ones, go to lightingcontrolspodcast.com, check out some episodes, news, maybe get some merch like this shirt or this cup over here. Just take a look at the website if you haven't seen it yet. But now, here's MHT. Well, welcome back, everyone, to the Lighting Controls Podcast, where we just love talking about lighting controls. Today, we've got some great guests, AK and Kim. AK and Kim, we haven't had two people here before, but why don't we just take turns? We'll start with AK. Give me a brief explanation of who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name is AK, short for Akram Khalis. I am Chief Technology Officer and co-founder of Inspector by MHT Technologies. I handle all technical aspect of the product, R&D, and product development. I've been with the company over a decade. Started in 2011, end of 11, and evolved since. I worked on a design division, and then since then, evolved all to the CTO role and management and things like that.
Great. And Kim?
Yeah, thank you. I'm Kim Johnson. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer at MHT. AK and I work very closely together on a lot of go-to-market strategies and, ensuring that we're hitting the mark with our product. I've been involved in the POE-based technology space since 2015. Prior to my time in technology, I worked in marketing consulting for some CPG brands, and that means Nestle, Tyson, Walgreens. So I came from a very different branding background. Took a chance, started at a different company in the POE lighting and technology space as their head of marketing, grew, and eventually there was an opportunity here at MHT. So I've actually been with MHT 9 months, I think now. So it's, I'm a little fresher to the team, but I've been involved in the industry for quite a while.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you both for joining us here today. I think what's interesting is POE. That really has piqued my curiosity about what you guys do, especially because it's such a weird topic. There's either people who are fast and furious, yes, POE everything all the time, and there are people who are like, no, why would you ever do POE? But I'm curious, what if you were to take a pulse on the community as a whole at large, where are we with widespread adoption of POE?
Kim, you want to take that?
I love that. I'm thinking because I love this question, in part because there's sort of two answers. The world we're in, it feels like this is inevitable and it's coming no matter what. We're seeing tremendous demand. We know our competitors are as well. Of course, there's that, and that's a sign of a growing, evolving market. I think that the technology, and I've made me discuss, I'd recently discussed this with another group somewhere else. Is I think the technology is 70-80% of the way there. It's pretty advanced. We can definitely do all the lighting controls that a typical lighting system can do. What POE lighting is going now is going beyond just lighting. And that's really where the interesting pushing the boundaries is from the technology perspective. From adoption, it depends on the markets you're in. I think if you're looking at urban markets, 10%. I mean, I think there's a huge opportunity. I think new projects coming on, we're increasingly seeing that POE is being considered, or someone's actually actively saying, I want POE lighting, go find the right person for it. But there's a lot of opportunity. But, we're based out of New York City. It's a hot market for it. So, we're a little colored because the market that we talk to the most is getting really excited about it.
And so what do you think oh, go ahead, AK.
Sorry. Yeah, if I can add to that, that's perfectly done, Kim. I think from a technology standpoint, we crossed a few milestones in the past couple of years, and I think we have reached. So if we look at the background, since 2014-15, where the first standard of AF, IEEE 802 that AT started, we started at 15 watts per port, and that was the first milestone, and it evolved until 90 watt, which was recently, 2019, was actually adopted. So I think those milestones showed the growth in technology, but to Kim's point, still was the fear of adoption, and is this really implemented? We want to see it at large scale. 2020 and 2021 and 2022, we have proven that, because we can point with the competitors, all of us collectively, that there are millions of square feet that's been deployed, functional, working at a larger scale. So the adoption is open, and now people are actually looking into it more seriously because they crossed a few thresholds. One, from a technology standpoint, yes, we have reached a few years now that the technology evolved, and also it's scalable. It's not a flash in the pan that's going to go away.
Sure. Well, I mean, that all makes a lot of sense to me, in terms of, when technology, the technology that we're getting there. But, what is one of the major hurdles to that switch being flipped where we're at that widespread adoption? I mean, yes, there is high demand for this kind of thing, but we're not ubiquitous at this point.
Great question. I think number one for me could be still education. The stakeholders in the building are still using old methods. If you take a look at it, just in the lighting itself, it crosses multiple stakeholders, architect, MEPs, GCs, and starting with the owner at top. Still, those stakeholders are still evolving at their own pace. They're still thinking about the technology that they've used, and they know they can't switch it quick enough because they want to make sure that they're risk adverse. I think the challenge is education, getting that education out there that proves to not only the people we talk to, but across worldwide, to understand that this technology not only has been proven, but it's not us saying it. There's actually use cases, studies, and proven projects that can point to, and now you can start making that change.
It's easy to do things the same way you've always done it, is what AK is saying. And this is a little bit disruptive because the infrastructure is different, and it takes different suppliers in some instances, different installers. So the ecosystem exists for it. It just is new to some people, and anything new has perceived risk and can be scary.
So I kind of want to piggyback on Webster's question a little bit too. So I'll be the first to admit I don't know a ton about POE lighting. I know a little bit from some of the various manufacturers we work with, but I'm curious, aside from like the power consumption, right, and the power per port that has been changed over the last couple of years, what are some of the other hurdles? Is there, I guess, a two-part question. What are some of the hurdles, and is there an ideal space? Is this are we talking 8-foot ceilings, 10-foot ceilings? Are there ideal spaces and spaces where this isn't the right option?
So I think from that's a great question. The second one, I'll start with the second one and I'll answer the first. Really, the verticals are commercial real estate. I think so far, because it's an infrastructure change, it's not meant yet for single homes. So we won't see that market there. We see a lot of commercial real estate, and it's really an infrastructure change where it doesn't matter what the foot seal is. It could be 10, 15, etc. And also, there's one extra factor to remember is the LED lighting doesn't change. So from an architect standpoint, they look at it or a lighting designer, it's the same exact lighting fixture that you would have selected. It's now being powered differently. So from a power standpoint, it's just where it's different. And of course, now it takes different trades and different parties to get involved in order for it to be installed successfully. But at the same time, if you look at your first question is whether or not the adoption has been done in multi-verticals. It has been. There are multi-deployments right now in multi-verticals, commercial real estate, hospitalities, healthcare, MDUs, etc., where it fits specific use cases, and that's why the owners or customers decided to use it. And I think one of the benefits could be that the fact that now with an IP infrastructure, you can integrate a building, rather the old way of doing it, you can have a smart lighting controls, but it's its own silo. And in order for you to integrate it, it might be a little bit difficult.
So, I mean, from a technology standpoint, we're not changing the fixtures, but we are changing everything else, everything from the fixture back to network switches and everything. That is changing, though. And so, what's the best method of making that happen? Because I know right now in the lighting controls world, dealing with IT groups is really challenging when you're not using their hardware already. So now that you are using their hardware, you've got extra involvement with the IT groups. What are you seeing from that interaction?
It's truly still hybrid. It depends on the project. It's either facility heavy or IT heavy, or a hybrid where they have to collaborate and work with each other. And I think it's the same model as when we switched over from IP phone, or switch over from regular phone to IP phone. That shift has been around where you have to introduce IT into the infrastructure. It just happened to be LED lighting now, and that's it's really it's by project basis where you can find those collaborations or clashes depending on how the project is run.
Sure. So ultimately, I mean, you're working with the IT groups to be able to do this, but are you getting pushback from IT groups saying, well, what about cybersecurity? How am I doing all the portfolio? Like, there's a lot of intricacies to getting IT involved that otherwise you wouldn't necessarily have to belabor. So what is there still a lot of friction in that case?
I think we've seen projects where IT is actually the biggest advocate for this, and then projects where IT is the biggest detractor. And it can really come back to, honestly, the culture of the IT department and whether they're used to taking a leadership role in making decisions at that company or not. If they're understaffed and always playing catch up and having to deal with people still clicking on phishing links and buying gift cards, their level of tolerance for adding more to their workload is pretty low. But I think in some ways, when we see IT teams embracing this, it's because they can see beyond just the POE lighting. They can see the potential because they've got the infrastructure mindset already. So some of the most successful projects that we're seeing in the New York City market and in a few other instances were designed with technology first. And it wasn't saying explicitly, we're definitely doing POE, but it was, what do we want to accomplish in our space? And lighting is just a part of it. But if you can include lighting, because it's one of the most impactful things on the occupant's experience of the building, you can achieve kind of some incredible stuff. And despite the changing market and talk of recession, people are still not coming back to the office, especially if your office is a dungeon. So, when you can add in the smart building technology and, maybe a deep retrofit, or you're downsizing your space, but you want it to be higher quality, then it's often with technology first, and then there tends to be that conversation. IT might get involved, architects, designers, whether it's Gensler or someone else, they might get involved and be asked to design with the outcomes in mind first. Then you start to see that POE has a very compelling use case, and it goes beyond just lighting. But that's obviously one of the biggest parts about it.
It's an interesting comparison to VoIP phones that you made, AK. I don't know why my brain didn't process that right very quickly, but it should have. So is that a selling point or a feature that you use when you talk to clients about how to, because IT has embraced that technology, right? There's not even a question anymore. No one is doing basic landlines, right? That is what everyone is doing. So is that a selling point that you use when you're starting these conversations with clients about how to deal with IT?
Absolutely. I think the question that came up all the time in the beginning is this really scalable? And we point always to the higher density item that's in every office. That's a voice over IP phone. So the question is, well, if I deploy this on a network, is it going to eat up my broadband? And do I need another ISP provider? Do I need internet? And some of these questions can easily be answered by just pointing at the same technology in a different method. And voice over IP check that box, as well as access points, things like that. So absolutely, we're using it to just prove that it's the same exact technology. It's just now we're powering an endpoint that's different, giving us other data that we're not. That's completely different than voice over IP.
So let's imagine that I'm a lighting controls or lighting designer, and I've never done POE in my life, and now I have a client who's saying I want to do this thing called POE, and so I grab you guys and I say, how do I do this? What are the first steps in a project?
Yeah, I would just want to plug. I would tell them to go to AK's presentation at Leducation next week, and it's March. Which day is it? March 7th, AK?
7th between 2:30 and 3:30.
Unfortunately, this is going to air after Leducation.
Oh no! Okay, well, it might be available afterwards, and if not, a lot of trade shows from AIA to Leducation to Light Fair are having speakers talk about this. So you can, even in your normal professional development, even if you don't have a client talking to you right now about it, go and get some exposure so that when they do, you can sound educated about it. And then I'm going to turn it over to AK to talk a little bit about that sort of the crux of the question that you asked there. Like, what are some of those first steps?
Yeah, I think from a lighting designer's perspective, they would look at the fixture schedule and they would look at the control narratives. So as long as it meets both questions, if I'm going to pick a specific light fixture, I want that specific light output or specific light fixture from a design standpoint, POE would match that. And if the control narrative specifies a specific control mechanism, most likely POE is also going to match it. So I think from a start, as long as they're understanding that, aesthetically, it's not going to look different below the ceiling, to your point. After, behind the ceiling, all of that infrastructure is going to change. It's going to give you an endpoint that's provide you power and data. So the first step is really just to embrace that aspect of, I'm not changing anything drastically from below the ceiling. From a customer standpoint, nothing has changed. Maybe I have a lot more power behind the ceiling because now I can take all this data and do other things with it throughout the building.
So that's a good first step for sure. But who owns the scope in the end, designer wise and contractor wise? Who owns the scope of the POE network?
Typically, you'll see master integrators or consultants that would come in and actually evolve in the project and become the expert in the project to guide, all that scope and things that needs to be done.
Integrators under the IT division?
Not necessarily. They're typically just an independent. So they would be under the GC. They would be also under the IT. Depends. But we've seen them a lot under the GC.
So you see them specified in a completely different division than electrical, mechanical, IT?
That's still, yes, they are being spec'd in different divisions. Typically Division 26 is electrical, Division 23 is different, and things like that. But you will find pieces of and components of the POE lighting are specified in different divisions. If it's control related, then the control narrative would specify a specific function that's POE related. And if it's electrically
But
wide, from electrical standpoint.
so technically, I mean, looking at this from a general contractor's perspective, it's almost like they need another subcontractor involved to overview everything POE and make sure that all the different divisions are coordinated well.
We've Go ahead, Kim.
I think,
Oh, I thought you were going to say
and
something.
AK, yeah, no, and AK, add your thoughts here because I'm veering a little bit into maybe an area where I think I know, but AK can always correct me if I misspeak here. My understanding is that that can happen, but then also I've seen MEP firms who are taking on a low voltage installer approach as well. So I don't think it necessarily will always be a separate contractor, but there are companies that are coming up in this space filling that void because the established players don't have that expertise or are unwilling to take that on. So there are some companies now that have several years of experience working on POE based installations for lighting, maybe the whole ceiling, because remember, you're taking out the line, you're reducing from line voltage to POE, which means you're replacing essentially two different wires and cables that you'd have up there anyways into one. So it makes the installation typically simpler on these projects, typically faster. And there's companies that are coming in saying, that sounds awesome. And we want to be that value add contractor there.
So, I mean, if we have any contractors listening, it sounds like a competitive edge to have is to learn how to do POE systems on your own so you don't have to lean on an integrator. Sorry, Ron.
It's
But
all right.
at the same time, there's plenty of opportunity for integrators to jump into this as well and be that subcontractor to an electrical contractor that has this in their scope.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah, I think that.
so
Yeah,
yeah,
sounds
so I
right.
mean, from a specifier standpoint, then how do I tell people and dole out the scope in that regard? If I'm stuck in Division 26, do I just grab everything I can and shove it into Division 26?
We do have bullet templates that would go into different divisions, like 26. So Inspector we have a specific way of specifying POE lighting in that division. So it starts with obviously having a DC driver, so that automatically eliminates the AC portion. And there's a few factors that you want to have when you're deploying a POE infrastructure that only works in low voltage rather than high voltage.
And something you can consider is finding a manufacturer and brand like us, for example. But I know we're not the only players, but you could talk to a company like us and ask, or develop a relationship with one or two vendors that you can really start to feel comfortable specifying their technology in that, and you can learn over time. Because you're right, it doesn't always fit perfectly neatly into one space. Because what if you want to use Inspector for an integration to your HVAC in some way, to at least like bring in the data from that. And that's a different, schedule. And then you start to get into access controls, and maybe you get into, more than what we're even seeing now. There's really not a lot to limit you because it's low voltage DC, and because there's the open API, which does allow for you to also integrate different systems into one software.
So I'm curious, just sort of circling back to the whole Division 26 thing, especially where you guys are in New York. So I know the rules in New York are a little different than in certain areas of the country. And Division 26, as far as lighting and even low voltage terminations, has quite the hold on certain aspects of that, right? And there's a lot of union regulations. So have you come across that where the lighting is in Division 26, but the owner maybe wants an integrator who's not necessarily in the union, and Division 26 is then fighting that, no, we own all the terminations, and how have you guys sort of helped to navigate that?
There's a lot of the answer is really it depends, but I'll give out some use cases that I've seen. because it really varies depending on, even in New York, it's very difficult to point at a specific area, because you could have a building that's union and non-union at the same
Yeah.
time. What we have seen
And just to
work.
be clear, we don't make, some of these decisions aren't decisions that we personally can influence or make. So what we
Of
often will need
course.
to, I'm sorry, AK, but we approach every project and we kind of see what's established and then work within those parameters. So AK has a few examples that we've done and we've heard of happening.
And that's exactly right. To Kim's point, is it's on a case by case basis, and we're just a facilitator of how it gets done. In cases where you have Division 26 that's union, typically the installer or that electrician would hang the fixture, and then the low voltage contractor runs the wire, and then the electrician would still plug it in. So it's that core correspondence and communication of how to put that together all at once. In certain cases, it's all done by electricians' unions, right? It's just a matter of now the labor is a lot is the same, but the amount of time it's a lot less to run cables versus to run VX, etc. So at the end of the day, the end user decides what goes on in the building or in their space, and we're just there to support it.
So speaking of time, how long does it take to develop a POE design? Like if I had a floor in a building in downtown New York, the whole floor is getting equipped for POE. How long would it take to coordinate that in just the design phase?
So typically we would take the takeoff from lighting designer or architects, and we would just take that and put it in our design guideline and come up with a bill of materials that's POE related. We don't have necessarily a time frame per project, but it's just like estimating the amount of lighting that you would need in the scope.
Mm-hmm.
So in our world, our design team is obviously used to it, so they'll do it much faster than a typical electrician. But typically, we offer that service to all our customers. So we would do it in house, and would just need to take off and convert it back into a bill of material that's POE ready, that gets plotted into the plans, and the MEP would have to approve it and stamp it.
So ultimately, if I have a lighting layout and it's all POE ready fixtures, I could just send you that layout without having to do any real back end calculations or drawings on my side, and you would just then lay your template on top of that and say, okay, here's where we need switches, this is the distance limitations, all of that.
That is correct. That's exactly
Interesting.
right. There are partners that do that as well throughout. To Kim's point, that specialize in that and do it for all vendors, but we have that as well.
I mean, I think that's
one
a
of the
big
services.
Yeah, that's a big service for lighting designers, especially ones who are less familiar with POE, to be able to do that, because otherwise you have to learn all of this stuff that you guys are already experts in.
And that's a true point. We understood that in the very beginning. That's why our design team was always in house, and we help our partners, help the lighting designers, the architects, to get familiar with it, and even the MEP. So that way, we don't want to be in the design industry. We're manufacturers of product and technology, but we've figured, since the starting point, every time no one is the expert other than us, and the question always comes back to us. That's where that whole division got started about 7-8 years ago, of just doing design work where we could take in the reflective ceiling plan.
And eventually, our more mature partners become more confident. They have the skill set in house, and they might not need the full service. They might just want us to do a quick review or something like that. And I think that's really where we want most of our partners to get to, or people who work with us, to the point where they feel empowered in house to go, because we're tech experts. We have a different expertise. We have a history of lighting manufacturing at this company, so we really have a deep lighting background. A lot of our team gets lighting at a much deeper level than maybe other companies will in this space, and so I think that was a huge driver too, is just understanding what lighting was and realizing that even though we're focusing on the software, hardware development, we need to provide the service. To us, it's important that the project goes well. And that's our number one goal for all of our customers, all of our partners. It doesn't matter whose fault it is in the end. If something goes badly, the partner, the lighting designer might never want to do one again. So let's collaborate. Let's make sure that they know that this service is available, and we'll make sure it works.
All right, so I have a question about how do you guys handle emergency lighting, right? So how do we handle UL 924? I'm very curious about this.
So there are a few methods to do UL 924 and POE. I'll start with the centralized method, where the IDF has switches that are dedicated emergency, and those emergency POE switches would be backed up by a UPS. That UPS can serve both ways.
I'm sorry, are the switches also 924 listed?
No, they're just regular switches.
But because your power is, okay.
Correct. And then you backed up by UPS, which essentially is driven by a generator, or if you have a UL 924, especially in healthcare, they require a UL 924 UPS that lasts 90 minutes, the whole 90 minutes, and then the generator. So that's centralized way of doing it. In New York City, it's not approved. So you have to have line voltage driving into the fixture, and then the POE is basically a factor. So our ELS model, emergency lighting switch, it's a product that takes in line voltage and POE at the same time. In normal operation, POE is driving the fixture, powering it, and controlling it. And in the event of a POE loss, the uninterrupted emergency, the line voltage AC is driving the fixture full on with no controls.
Got it.
That's
okay, that makes sense.
Centralized way of doing it. Good.
Because I was curious. I assume your fixtures fall under the classification of a directly controlled luminaire, right? So, have you encountered that where they've requested the fixture itself be 924 listed as well?
Yes, that also can be possible, and the fixture could be UL 924 listed.
Okay.
Go ahead. You had a question.
Oh yeah. So are you sending line voltage down the category cable then?
No, it's completely separate, two dedicated lines. And that's only in the ELS model, emergency lighting switch. You'd have a line voltage going into the emergency lighting fixture, and then the POE is a whole different line powering it. That only applicable in New York. The centralized way that we talked about, just backing up the switch, is deployed in many places outside of New York City.
Sure.
But in New York City, you can't do that. Then we have a decentralized model, which also, go ahead. You had a follow-up?
Continue.
Just the slowness of adopting essentially with the New York City regulation, it does add cost to these projects. So, I know there's people working on this, things can be slow to change, but in some ways, for better or worse, or, luckily for most people, their local jurisdiction won't have the same issue where you're mandated to include the line voltage.
And then in a decentralized method, you'd have POE switches powering a battery, a decentralized battery UL 924, which MHT offers. And then that battery is in series with the fixture in a connection. So in the event of losing power, it's just like a ballast of line voltage, right? So you'd have an exit sign that has a ballast, or a fixture that has a ballast in it. Same way. The battery is being charged while you have power. In the event of a power interruption, the battery takes over UL 924, 90 minutes, test buttons, etc.
So I'm going to shift directions now, because Kim, you mentioned something at the very beginning of this, which was beyond lighting, and so I want you to kind of clarify what that is. What is it that POE provides that is beyond lighting?
I love this. So, because it relates directly to the construction of a smart building, and smart buildings are inherently more supportive of a sustainable future. So that's what can drive my passion in this industry. I don't necessarily have a deep passion for POE cables, but I love what the technology can do. And with the increased wattage at every port, that means it can provide more and more power. All of these devices out there, from sensors to ceiling fans, shades, lighting fixtures, they're coming down in their power consumption as well. So what's happening is kind of considered a convergence. You can put more and more things on this POE network. It gets an IP address. It shows up in our software. You can assign and control it, and you can create the automations. So, at the most basic level, it's the concept of if this, then that. So you've got all of these connected devices. They're now IoT devices, including your lighting fixtures. And they're part of this Internet of Things that can start to talk to each other, react to each other, learn, provide data, and your building starts to become an intelligent building that can adapt to your needs as determined in the future. An example is, back in 2015, really with the power and the fixture, like it was mostly just lighting, maybe some sensors. And then you started seeing use cases of adding in motorized shades, which suddenly, consider Texas, like hot sun in the summer, you want those shades to just come down. You don't want people to have to go press buttons. What about that conference room that's not occupied? Just kind of shut all the lights off, put the shades down, keep it dark and cool for that next meeting. And then when the pandemic hit, you started to see some technology come out with UV light fixtures or different technologies that helped sanitize spaces became a big thing. Understanding air quality became a big thing. How many people were in a room? And some of those technologies weren't on the radar the year prior, but because there's this POE backbone and it's already set up with a software solution, it was as simple as essentially adding an IoT device to that backbone. Everything else is already there, and you can set up your interplay connections and automations between all these devices that exist. And who knows where we'll be in 4 or 5 years, or what new technology will come out. And if you've got an IoT infrastructure, it's inherently more adaptable than the old way of literally, having to tear out a wall switch to reprogram it and then put it back in. Just walk around with your iPad when the new executive comes in and be like, okay, what do you want this button to do? And you change it and it automatically updates. You can test it and integrate everything that you want, because I think in the end, I think AK was talking about this a little earlier, the occupants don't know what's in the walls, but they know how the building makes them feel, and they want to feel great. And they honestly, if you're doing technology right, they won't even notice it. So lighting plays a huge role in the experience of a smart building. That's why it was really important to actually get that on the network first, because if you can do lighting, you can do these other things, in many instances. So I love it because when it's software, it's just an update, software update. I shouldn't say just, there's a lot of work that goes in with AK's team on some of this stuff, but it's an update rather than having to tear out old technology and put it in most cases. So that building can keep growing with you. And isn't that better than having to keep doing deep renovation projects or adding in technology that becomes obsolete? Well, if that happens, you can more easily swap it out and hopefully ultimately prevent obsolescence of your building, at least delay it significantly more.
No, and I think, this goes on to a topic that Ron and I keep hitting on every now and then, which is trying to come up with a consistent protocol for fixtures. And the IP address is pretty ubiquitous in a lot of other facets of our life. And so using that as a way of communicating to the fixture, it makes a lot of sense to go in that direction. And then you have not just a consistent protocol between fixtures, but a consistent protocol between your lighting system and any other system in your building.
Absolutely. And I think just to add
no, go ahead,
one sentence to that is the ability to do it, keeping cybersecurity in mind, doing it securely. Because I think that's a huge factor when you talk about an IoT in a smart building. You want these devices to talk to each other, but only when they have to talk to each other with the right permissions. And that's something that MHT works on very, very closely with best practices and what we do in the back end.
And I think additionally, like you were saying, it has a little bit of future proofing in there because of the fact that, everything is just speaking via Ethernet. You can just pull the switch off the wall and replace it with a different switch or with a completely different device. You don't even have to do a one-to-one swap anymore. You're really open to whatever is available. Now, in that regard, with future-proofing, what about switch failures? And what are we looking at for a lifespan of a POE system?
So in the switch manufacturing, that also has evolved from a technology standpoint. So there are switch manufacturers today that have dual power supplies, power stacking redundancy. So you can have a stack of 8 switches that not only their power supply is dual, which means that even if it fails, you can hot swap a new one, but you could share that power throughout the entire stack, where even if one power supply fails, you share the access power throughout the 8 ports. So you can see how the risk gets smaller and smaller. And the ability to do that on the network only gives you that ability to see it when it happens, so you're proactively making the change, versus the old way. If the breaker trips or something else happened and failed, you have no clue. I mean, you can have a technology that still sends it, but in the Ethernet world or Power over Ethernet, you have that infrastructure ready to go. You have alerts, monitoring, events triggered at any given moment.
Interesting. So, I mean, a lot of people are wary of PoE because of historical switch failures and how short-lived switches used to be. So how would I be able to recognize a more robust switch versus this older format of switch?
I think by going to PoE switch manufacturers that are recognized, right? The Ciscos of the world and things like that are switches that are used in data centers that are still powering up networks right now that we live off of, right? Our banking system is still done that way and things like that. So I think, it's all within right now. Other PSE manufacturers, power source and equipments are getting there. The technology is getting there, but it's just the ability to pick the right choice is usually going with, one of the manufacturers that's been evolved for a while.
Yeah, it's hard to say this because I think it's true throughout our entire lives, right? In a lot of instances, you get what you pay for. And if you're trying to make a project super cheap and you're importing something from certain countries out there, and there might technically be a warranty on it, but you might find it difficult to get the help you need, the support, versus having maybe someone with an infrastructure, a network of dealers and sellers in the US that's really robust. Because I would look not just at how long is the warranty that they're offering, look at the depth of that. They do vary a little bit, but there are some industry standards. And then looking at their distribution of dealer network, can you get the support you need locally if something happens? And if that's the case, you're probably going into pretty those are some very good green flags to move forward. And these companies are putting their own technology in their own spaces. So they're implementing PoE technology at their headquarters in different offices, and they're going to feel the pain if their own product fails. So they're learning and they're doing it themselves as well. That's a great sign too, if that company has their own tech in the PoE space implemented in their headquarters.
I'd like to imagine too, it's probably a little bit easier when circling back to VoIP again, right? If everyone's been doing that for so long, I'd like to think that most people at this point know who the trusted, reliable players are. Circling back to the IoT stuff, I have a question on your control side. Do your devices back up to the cloud, or do they rely on the internet for their control, or is their control local? So if you lose your link to the internet, does your space still function? Do your controls still work?
Great question. One of the unique things about Inspector, it's actually one of the patents that we have is local controls, doing it differently with a tagging system. So the answer to your question is, if the internet goes out, which we know it's spotty most of the time anyway, lighting controls will still function. And if the server that's on-prem is gone away, also your lighting would function. And that came from the heritage of MHT itself. We started as a lighting company in 2009. So we understood that you cannot have lighting go out if the controls go out or a server gets an update, because that's very inherent, right? Anything else can wait. You can wait for configuration later. You can wait for monitoring later. Data can be lost, but not a lighting functionality. You want to walk in, motion triggers, every light should be on. And they don't have to be wired together, because in this case they're not wired together. So there is local configuration stored on each device, and they talk peer to peer also to make sure that that trigger or that event happens. And the answer to the last question is, do they back up to the cloud? The answer is yes. All of that information gets up to the cloud, and then you have that remote access and things like that.
And so with the software, I mean, you the name of your software is what you were referring to earlier. But so is it just sort of like a template software that you then customize based on a project, or is it something that's a little more advanced?
It's just the one software, and it's done almost like a lighting control system. If you're using it only for lighting control, so you'd have policies, control events. You can see the data on dashboards, create alerts, and then monitor them. And then what the beauty of Inspector, which is the software system, is the ability to integrate other things into it. So if you have data from shades, to Kim's point early, you can control the shades, see their status. Access control, same fashion. And you basically, those integrations are built locally in our headquarter. And what it allows us to do is, fortunately, every project we would have a customer that requests a feature, and that feature usually gets implemented, and it's basically available to the consumer to use, because now we work with this shaded manufacturer with this access control or that feature to do whatever the customer was implementing, or the use case. And we basically just build up that software. And now Inspector has many integrations and things that allows us to become, I don't want to use the word BAS. It's not a BAS yet, because there's a lot more things that's done in the BAS, but it's getting to that point where it's just an infrastructure or software piece that takes data from multiple POE devices and makes the logic and then shift it back out.
Interesting. So I've got a unique question for you guys, because this is something that always bugs me when I hear this term, POE. Does it bother you that technically the cable is not an Ethernet cable, and so you can't send power over a protocol?
As a marketer, I'm just going to say it doesn't bother me, because I'll just use what our customers use and how they use it. So, but AK, go ahead, get a little nerdy here with them.
I think that's a great question. Sometimes when people use the term Ethernet, in their mind they're thinking of data only, right? And power over Ethernet is actually sending power over that same data cable. So in a sense, it doesn't bother me, but I just sometimes when you look at the same cable, yes, it is transferring power, but there's another end device to negotiate that power. Yes, your laptop doesn't do that today. It doesn't negotiate power. If you plug in an Ethernet, you're just going to get data, but that's because your PD or the end device only wanted data. If you take the same cable and change the switch on the other side, make sure you have a PoE switch, you plug it to an access point, it's going to turn on and give you data. Plug it to a camera, it's going to turn on and start recording video. So in a sense, it's just data and power over the same category cable.
Yeah, but it's not. It doesn't bother you guys that the term is technically an invalid statement.
I have too many people I work with to correct, so I've just embraced it.
Fair enough.
Well, with you, we can change how we talk to you. How about that? This is
it's fine.
Marketing.
I mean, personally, it's just one of those things that I'm gonna probably go to my grave just crying out like but at the same time, to your points, it is sort of what people are referring to it now, and there's no way to back out of that. It's like COVID, technically there's coronavirus, for various types, and yet we happen to buy into just that. So ultimately, we're almost out of time here, but we've covered a lot of interesting stuff here, and I like to encapsulate what we've talked about at the end of the episode and get a little more input from you guys before we stop. But your company, you're a POE company. You do a huge amount of work outreach wise, education wise, as well as design wise, to make sure that the projects are successful. And that does require a bit of extra effort on your part as a manufacturer. A number of manufacturers out there, at least from the lighting standpoint, probably wouldn't put as much work in as you guys are putting in. But it sounds like other competitor POE groups are, at least to a degree. But it part of it is because of how difficult it is to really pin down where POE systems belong in the scope of a project. It really transcends one division. It covers a lot of different groups, and it sounds like it's easier to just have the general contractor own that scope instead of one subdivision. But from that ability to have a POE system in your building really expands the capabilities, and so it's really worth that effort on everybody's part to coordinate that kind of a system, because not only is it going to help you with your lighting system and improve the data analytics of it and the controls of it, but it'll also give some future proofing to it all. It'll really protect the end user. It gives the IT group much more of a stake in the game than it just being an auxiliary system that's isolated and maybe touching their internet system. It really allows them to take control over what devices and components are being utilized and implemented. And furthermore, the IT group acts like a maintainer for the system going forward, because it's their equipment, it's their software. And additionally, you really custom tailor to projects. So it's not just, out of the box copy paste for every project. You really custom tailor it. And because you're using IP protocol, you can really ad hoc throughout the project, even after the project, a control system that expands on its capability. So would you say that encompasses it? Oh, you got an extra thought, Kim?
Yeah, and I think this aligns, and I do think you've encompassed a lot of our conversation today. And I just want to say that our challenges that we've discussed here aren't inherently always unique to just this company. As you've identified, it's really about the industry. It's a change. It takes time. It takes education. And I was in November recently elected to be president of the POE Consortium. It started as a group of competitors that came together. So it truly is our direct competitors, and now it's expanded to include partners, people who provide the cables, provide the switches, provide the services. We're coming together because we know that this market has real potential to impact the world we live in, but we need to unify our efforts around education, maybe creating some design standards so it's not as hard every time, talking together as competitors and collaborators to push the market forward together. And that's really our goal. So if you do want to check out more, of course, come check out MHT, but you can also check out the POE Consortium and learn a little bit more about our efforts, or reach out to AK and I to talk about it, because I do want to say it was AK and I a year and a half ago. We had a bit of a conversation when I was working for a competitor about the challenges in the market, and we talked about trying to do something together, and then look at where we are now. So POE Consortium came from that. Yes. Now we're working together as collaborators, and we're seeing a lot of developments in the market, and I think that's a big reason why.
Excellent. Any other thoughts, AK, before?
I think you pretty much summarized it, and Kim, you put a bow on it. So I think from an overall perspective, just the technology is there. It's proven. That's really what I really always refer back to, and it's more than just it started for us. It's with a smart building, and if the goal is to have a smart building, you want to have an infrastructure that scales, that allows you to create that smart building. And when it comes down to lighting, we were always going through the ceiling, passing a light just to go to an access point or an Ethernet cable to power it and give it data. But we forgot that the highest density in the ceiling was lighting. So right now we're just doing the exact same thing. We're just now plugging it into a light rather than an access point or a camera. And that allows us to have more data points where we can take that information and do a lot more with it to create that sustainable environment in a smart building.
Well, awesome. Well, thank you so much, guys. This has been a really fascinating conversation about this, and we'll definitely have you back on the show in the future, because as you've noted, this is an ever-evolving topic, and there's always more and more questions to ask about this as we learn more and see how things develop.
Thank you.
Really appreciate the invite. Thank you.
Well, that was a really cool conversation. I learned a ton about POE, really great stuff. Hopefully you did too. But just want to thank our sponsor for this episode, Toggled. Ron, you want to talk a little bit more about Toggled?
Absolutely. So just want to thank Toggled again and just remind everyone that you are just a lamp swap away from adding network lighting controls to your building. Toggled has a grassroots approach to NLC. They added Bluetooth into their linear lamps, so you simply pop those lamps in, add their controls, and you are good to go. You're not doing a complete teardown on your building. Wireless controls makes it real easy. Cybersecurity, they have you covered. They have all the certifications you could possibly need, optional gateways to Cloud Connect. They have API integration, and there is no fee for their API integration. A truly customer-centric approach to NLC. And do not forget that Toggled views buildings holistically. They want to take care of everything and help you wrap everything under one bow.
So very similar to MHT in that regard, where they really want to integrate with all of the different systems in the building, just using a different protocol, different format. But definitely worth checking out if you're looking for some kind of holistic lighting control solutions that work with other systems. So check it out, Toggled, TOGGLED.com. Also, this podcast is presented by the Lighting Controls Association, or LCA, and financially supported by the National Association of Innovative Lighting Distributors, or NAILD. And again, if you want to check out any of our record episodes, go to lightingcontrolspodcast.com, where you can check out episodes, news, merch, whatever you want regarding this whole podcast. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you, MHT, for joining us.